So, without further ado, what I would like to do is just start us off with a devotion. Our devotion is led by Cassie Locker, who is one of our regional advocates. So Cassie is a worship and music director of First Reformed Church in Baldwin, Wisconsin. She is also regional advocate for Minnesota Classis RCA. Cassie has released her album, The Dawn, and the single Quiet Place, which we'll be hearing, all on digital platforms. And in her spare time, she enjoys reading, riding her tricycle, and spending time with her close friends. So I am going to get her, we're going to do two things. We're going to first have a little introduction where she's going to tell us about the writing of her song, and then I'm going to shift into listening to her song. Alrighty, so this is the introduction that she's gifted us with.
I wrote Quiet Place in the early part of 2020, right before the lockdown and the restrictions took hold. My pastor preached a sermon on the first chapter of Mark. He also based this sermon on an article that he had read by Henry Nouwen that was published in 1995. This article talked about three main factors: solitude, community, and mission. My pastor and the article talked about Jesus' example, how he would often go away to a quiet place to connect with the Father. He would set aside the demands of his ministry and his work with the disciples to have that time away with him. Then he would go out into community, he would call his disciples, he would perform miracles, and he would teach. And then when the time came, he called his disciples out, and they would go into the community by two. But once again, Jesus made a priority to connect with the Lord intimately and quietly, even in his last moments in the Garden of Gethsemane. I want to invite you today to accept God's invitation to meet with him in a quiet place.
Come with me to a quiet place. Seek my presence, seek my face. This sacred ground where two hearts meet. Lay your burdens at my feet. Leave your cares, your fears. Go and be sent from this place. Come and follow me. Come with me to a quiet place. Seek my presence, seek my face. This sacred ground where two hearts meet. Lay your burdens at my feet. Leave your cares, your fears behind. Be still and know, renew your mind. Come away to a quiet place with me.
I've already let Cassie know that that song touches me in a very deep spot. That sense of the quiet place and then moving in and being gathered with God's people and then going out in love. Count the cost because love, there's a cost to love. And then finally closing out again with the quiet place and that intimate relationship with God. So I'm Mark Stevenson. I've been serving as Director of Disability Concerns since 2006 and will for another 10 weeks or so. And then I'll be closing out my service with Disability Concerns with a new director who we anticipate that person's name will be announced tomorrow. So thrilled about that. And I am thrilled about being able to serve for the last over 15 years as Director of Disability Concerns. And delighted to be able to be together with all of you tonight. And really looking forward to our presentation by Dan and Marg. I've known Dan for a long time and consider him a friend, a colleague, an advisor, a confidant. We've had some wonderful conversations together in groups and one-on-one. So I'm just really thankful for Dan for his work. I remember Dan serves on the Disability Concerns Advisory Committee. I remember one particular evening back 2008, maybe early 2009, he started talking about, I got this idea about this disability continuum. And he started bouncing off his ideas, and we were all getting really excited about it. And that's what eventually emerged after Dan did a lot of conversations with a lot of people with the 5 stages of changing attitudes about disability. So Dan's married to Denise a little over 25 years now, father to Ben and Emma, who are 23 and 21, member of Orland Park Christian Reformed Church in Illinois, where he serves on the Disability Concerns team and the Welcoming team. And he serves as Director of Advancement, Marketing, and Communications at Elim Christian Services, where he composed the Disability Ministry Resource, the 5 stages. Margdantema, or Margaret, and her husband Fred have been married for 35 years. Margaret writes, "The Lord has blessed us with 3 very challenging children. Our oldest lives in Fergus, Ontario, in one of the wonderful homes run by Anchor Association." So, Dan, Margaret, Marg, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate that. And Mark and I have met a couple of times by phone. So it's good to see her in person. It's also great to see so many familiar faces from just a few months ago at the disability leadership meeting that we had. So good to see many of you again. And I am going to kind of take you through some of the thinking behind the 5 stages and some of the reasons why I maintain that it's important to really focus on changing attitudes in our churches and among our fellow believers. And Margaret and I have talked about the experiences she has had and her family has experienced with attitudes around their son and the life that he has led with his disabilities. And so she's going to give some practical, real-world examples of what that looks like. And I'm thinking that in her words, you might even see some examples that ring true for you as well. So I just like to start out by explaining kind of my situation, how we got to this point, why the 5 stages even exist. When I was born, there was damage to a nerve cluster at the base of my brain, which left me disabled. That nerve cluster rendered me unable to swallow. And my parents were told that I was going to be developmentally disabled, that because I could not swallow, I would never talk. I would never eat on my own. I would never walk. And I probably would live life as what we in America called a vegetable back then, a very friendly and encouraging term to use for a living human being. And I very early on felt like, my life was about overcoming my disability. That seems to be the theme that you not only have for yourself when you have a disability, but what other people seem to focus on when it comes to your disability as well. So I always felt a lot of tension about that, especially because as I grew up in my core community, my church, my school, my family, I never got treated as though I had a disability. But every time I got outside that bubble, it became very obvious to other people and even to my friends that other people recognized me immediately as someone with a disability. And they wondered and would often ask, what was wrong with me? That tension, that difference created a tension in myself. And that was between overcoming my disability, which is one way that we often look at disability. And the other side of that tension was simply accepting disability. We have another tension in our world today which celebrates disability and sees it as a positive thing. But at that time, I really thought about it really in terms of the struggle between just overcoming disability and accepting disability. And I always looked at my life in terms of overcoming. And that's how I thought I had lived my life. I got to a point where I graduated from college. I didn't have to go to special education school like my parents had been told. I didn't die when I was very young. I learned how to eat quite clearly. I learned how to talk. I figured out a way to do that, even though I wasn't supposed to be able to. All of those things testified to an ability to overcome. And so that's how I often saw myself, as somebody who overcame. And then when I got married and had children, started having a career, it seemed like I had done everything I needed to do to overcome my disability. And I started working at Elam Christian Services and had been working there for some time when I went on a promotional trip with a few of the people that we serve and some coworkers. And we were out at a restaurant with everybody around the table. And a waitress comes up to the table and she introduces herself. And she goes around the table and asks everybody their name. And when she was talking to my coworkers, she had a very, plain, straightforward, peer-to-peer tone to her voice. And then when she talked with the adults with disabilities that we had brought along, some of our clients, her tone changed. Her head kind of tilted to the side. She got a bit of a sweet lilt to her tone of voice. And I thought, sitting there, well, that's nice. She's being very kind and engaging for our adults. And she turned to me, and I said one of the phrases that usually doesn't make me sound so disabled, I'm Dan. And I thought I got away with it until I noticed that her tone, the tone that she took with the adults with disabilities we serve, did not change when she talked to me. She identified me as somebody with a disability. Clearly, I felt I hadn't overcome my disability. And I went back to my room very my hotel room that night, very, very upset. And after talking it over with my wife, I realized that one of the reasons I was upset is not because I was treated that way, but because I didn't get upset about it until the treatment was directed at me. It was okay for her to talk to our adults with disabilities that way, but for some reason in my head, it wasn't okay for me to be talked to that way. That attitude should not have been directed toward me. Well, that's, ludicrous. Why would I deserve better treatment than our adults with disabilities? Why do I inherently deserve more respect? Because I'm somewhere further along on the spectrum of so-called being normal or not disabled or something? It really caused me to think a lot about the attitudes that I saw around me, especially at Elam. The people that I work with at Elam clearly saw our adults differently, saw our children differently, and they saw potential, not just the disability, not the thing that made you different. So I really went back to my room that night, not only thinking about what had made me upset, but really trying to understand why people had different attitudes toward different people with different disabilities, different abilities, or different disabilities. And that's how I started writing down the 5 stages. Really, that first night, started writing it down. As Mark said, I bounced it off of the group at Disability Concerns and went through it with a lot of other people. But basically what the effort is to identify what it is that is causing us as churches and us as individual Christians to change and adapt our treatment of people based on what we assume about how they can be used and how they can serve in the kingdom. And so one of the things that Mark can do for us is share about how she has seen attitudes have an impact on her and on her family, especially on her son, Cameron. Mark, would you be willing to share for a couple minutes how Cameron has been supported by the church and maybe how he hasn't?
Thank you. I guess, how do I explain that? Cameron is a very high needs individual. He needs a lot of support day by day. And so it got to the point when I couldn't take it anymore. And I was talking to our elders at a home visit, and I said, I'm so done. I just want to run away. And they didn't know what to say. They were speechless. I was actually quite shocked myself. And what they ended up doing is, with the deacons, they came up with a monthly respite care for Cameron in our congregation. So there was probably about 7 families that participated, and he got so much out of that. And we got a weekend off, which was really, really nice. Yeah.
Awesome. Are there any examples for you, Marge, of ways that you have not seen that support come through from a Christian community, maybe even not necessarily your church?
I do think that there wasn't an awful lot of contact between our church members and Cameron, or even our church and us. It seemed like Cameron was people seemed to be a bit scared, intimidated by him for some reason. There's a thing. We have a school, too, that we send all our kids to, an elementary school. And it's practice that when your first child goes to school, you get a visit by the board. Well, we never did. And we understood that Cameron's needs were probably too high for our school, but we didn't get a visit. And we really felt left out, not wanted in the community. And I think they actually missed an excellent opportunity to get to know somebody who had disabilities, but who was just a very happy, charming, cheerful guy. Yeah, I think that was our biggest and that sort of continues on throughout much of his life at home, is that feeling of being really separate. So I think that's one of our our biggest challenges is to feel that connection to a congregation.
Yeah, you're really kind of highlighting that first stage in a lot of ways, Mark. What happens in a lot of situations is that a real distance between the people who are somehow connected to the disability and the people who, feel like maybe that's not so much something they need to be concerned about, or that they need to participate in addressing. And that's why I think it's so important that we do make effort to change attitudes, because attitudes aren't something that are forced on us. They're things that we choose to adopt. And I think, we all benefit, especially in the disability community. We benefit a lot from decades of advocacy that's happened. Advocacy usually happens in the political sphere or the public sphere. And so I apologize because I know getting political is a bad idea these days, but I'm just going to step into that without talking too much about the right or the left. But when we do focus on advocacy and on rights for people with disabilities, there's a lot of benefits that can happen. But one of the things that doesn't happen is it doesn't necessarily change attitudes. It can, over time, change societal attitudes. And I think we're seeing that with some of the requirements for disability access and community access. So there are, like I said, a lot of benefits. But let's give you an example. If we have a parking lot today that yesterday you could park in any spot you wanted, but the next day there's some accessible spaces put in, there will be somebody who wanted to park in that space, that handicapped space, who no longer can. They view that as an infringement. That kind of advocacy, as good as it can be, can also create resentment. And it also means that, we're not necessarily going to have a change in attitude for that person who has to accommodate, is being forced to accommodate. So I feel like while advocacy is very important, definitely needs to be done, I also think it's very important, especially in our churches, to focus on equipping people to change their attitudes. Especially since in our Lord's word, anytime that there is change, anytime that people are changing, it's because somebody else has made a sacrifice for them. We see so often in the Bible examples of people laying down their rights, their opportunities, their life for someone else. And I think that's the example we're trying to follow when we try to equip people to change attitudes. We want our hearts, and we want to encourage our church members' hearts to be aligned with God's heart. And when we do, our attitudes can and do change to conform to his kingdom. When a person desires to change attitudes, that will always have a more lasting and life-impacting change than a forced change, something that they're forced to do. That person who has changed their attitude will want to create accessible parking spaces. They won't feel like they've been forced to do it or that the government has mandated it on them. They will want to change it because their attitudes have changed. And that community is a much more naturally accessible community. So that's why I think changing attitudes is so important. And getting to the attitudes as Mark has laid them out already, the first one is about that separation, that feeling of isolation. So along with teaching you the attitudes tonight, I am going to teach you some hand symbols for the attitudes. The first one is this one. This is the person with a disability. This is the person without a disability. This person in the first stage, ignorance, they are completely separate. So in ignorance, the person without a disability goes forward in service without ever including the person who has a disability. In fact, the person with a disability doesn't matter at all in the scheme of serving Christ in his kingdom. Ignorance is an attitude where we completely view people with disabilities as having no relevance to the work of God. We do not need to have them in our communities. They are not important for our churches. They are totally dispensable, in other words. That's ignorance. The second stage, which is, again, signified by the people with and without disabilities, the person with a disability pities the person without a disability, pities the person with a disability. So that second stage is pity. This person pours into the other person. The only thing that they can give them is pity. They feel sorry for them. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of pity as I understand it. First pity is a negative pity. That negative pity simply says, that's too bad. That's too bad that that person is disabled. It's too bad that they have to go through that. But the second kind of pity is positive pity. And that positive pity also says, that's too bad. That's hard. What can I do? How can I help? How can I be part of that person's life? That's how we move forward, is by certainly valuing pity, but pursuing positive pity. Now, one quick caveat too, actually 3 quick caveats. First of all, every one of these stages, as negative as they might sound, is absolutely essential to the journey of disability attitudes. Secondly, you can be experiencing the same attitude with different people at the same time. You can see one person as a co-laborer and be struggling to have anything but pity for somebody else. It doesn't mean you should stay there, but it is possible to have a different attitude with different people at the same time. Finally, our attitudes can widely differ in our own churches and in our own communities, and we want to keep on calling each other to better and better attitudes. So, Mark, now I wanted to ask you whether you have seen instances of ignorance and pity in your experiences with Cameron.
Yeah, I think the ignorance is the one where people just don't even recognize him as much as a person. You know, having coffee after church at the coffee social, one of us always had to be on top of Cameron or just take him to the vehicle, because he was so much, you know, in everybody's face, or he would knock people's coffee over, or he would, you know, run away, he'd pound on something. So, and it was just expected that just one of us would always go, and there was never anybody that said, hey, can I help out? So that was also creates more of a distance between us. Like you were talking about the hand signal. As for pity, I'm not good at recognizing pity. I don't feel pity for myself, and I don't really feel pity necessarily for people. That's too bad. I don't do that because I don't find that very helpful at all. The only thing I can say, and the problem here is that Cameron and Fred and I are so intertwined. He's never on his own. So I'm trying to give this example, and at the same time, it really involves us. So apologize for that, but I don't know how else to do it. But Cameron didn't start walking till he was 7. And when he finally started walking, somebody would say, oh, see, I told you, I knew he would do it. You shouldn't have worried. And I thought, the doctors didn't know. We didn't know, but you did. And it kind of negates all of the work that went into it and all the concern and worry and whatever else. So I don't know if that's pity or not, but that's my take on it.
Well, I think it's definitely an example of a distance. And in some ways, it's a comment that justifies the distance that they want to have from the situation, rather than recognizing the amount of work and praying and effort that goes into that. And not to oversimplify, but it sounds a little bit like that's what she was saying about the situation, was that you ought not have worried that it wasn't that big of a deal, when it honestly was a big deal. When people minimize the struggles that others have gone through, it is often a way of justifying the distance that they're maintaining from the situation. I don't know if that's exactly what was going on, certainly, but I do think that's a form of maintained ignorance and just negative pity. You're not really close to the situation. But that's actually a good transition to the next stage in the 5 stages. We talked about pity, where the person without disabilities is simply looking down on somebody who does have disabilities. In the 3rd stage, the person without disabilities comes in support of the person with disabilities. And that 3rd stage is care. That 3rd stage is where we're finally saying, I belong alongside you. I need to be with you. Now, you require my support in order to, exist, in order to be served. But at the very least, you're actually with the person with the disabilities, and you're not distant or distanced from them. Care is often seen in Christian community and in other communities as well as the highest expression of attitude toward people with disabilities. I think for most of my life, I thought that was the highest expression of attitudes. And I think part of my fear of being treated like someone who had a disability was that all I would be worthy of was care, that I would not be treated as a peer because I was always simply somebody that people cared for and had to support. But that's why it's so important that we recognize that we're only halfway through the journey. Care is only a halfway point. It is not the end of the journey in attitudes toward people with disabilities. But it is a very important part of the journey. And in many cases, I need people to show me care. I don't need them necessarily to always be a co-laborer with me, or I should say, in order to be a co-laborer, sometimes what I need most is care. I don't necessarily need them to be holding me accountable at every second or encouraging me or equipping me at every second. Sometimes I just need care. I need attention, as many other people with disabilities do. Do you see that in your life too, Mark?
Yeah. Cameron really requires an awful lot of support. And we had this one woman who came to us. She had experience with her own handicapped child. She came to us and said, now, you're going to have to accept help. You're going to have to accept help. And it's very apparent that he needs it and that you need it. She was amazing. She was an amazing person. She was one person who came up to us and said, this is what you need to do. And that came from experience. And she actually was instrumental in us applying for special needs workers. And those special needs workers, the 2 of them, one was her daughter who works for one of the Anchor homes, and another one, they also, but they did it in a way that wasn't a parent's care. It was really one of their peers. So it was a really different experience. Yeah, I think that was the neatest thing. And it really translated from care to friendship. It was amazing.
Well, one of the beautiful things I hear in that, Mark, is that kind of attitude requires humility for this person to tell you that you're going to have to accept help. She's essentially saying you're going to have to be humble and realize that you can't do it on your own. And the people who come alongside you in that situation and then express care for Cameron, but do so in a way that leads to friendship, that requires humility as well. That requires them to say, this person is not somebody that I'm just caring for as an object. This is somebody that is a full person created in God's image, and I'm going to recognize the dignity of this image bearer as fully as I can while I'm working alongside them. And that's a nice transition into stages 4 and 5. So care is a wonderful next step, but it is also still only a one-way street. It is about our attitude toward that person and how we treat that person. Mm-hmm. In stages 4 and 5, we're finally talking about real relationship between persons with disabilities and people who do not have disabilities. So stage 4 is friendship. Now, care was person without disabilities supporting people with disabilities. Friendship is when you're together. Your lives are intertwined. They are mutual. They are reciprocal. They are real relationships. They are not false relationships that aren't, deep, that are just on the surface and shallow relationships. They are true relationships where you share secrets, you share laughs, you get to really know each other. And that's friendship. And that's friendship that we all know from all of our lives. And that attitude should be extended to our brothers and sisters with disabilities as well. But going on from friendship, the most natural progression then is co-laborers. Co-laborers, now remember, at the very first stage, we said ignorance was people without disabilities going in front of people who had disabilities, but going out and serving them without the people with disabilities. In stage 5, co-laborers, we go out together. People with and without disabilities serving together. Now, how does that happen? How do we really become co-laborers? Well, the Bible is full of stories about what co-laboring looks like. We often think about co-laboring in terms just of work, but it's really about just equipping each other to do what God has called us to do. And that kind of instruction is found throughout the letters to all the churches that Paul wrote. Oftentimes, he uses phrases like encourage one another and build each other up. Encourage one another into every good work. We think of the letter that he wrote to the Ephesians, and in Ephesians 2, verse 10, when he says that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. I often say about that verse and many other verses that there's not an asterisk on that verse that would send your eye to the bottom of the page where it says, unless you have a disability. There is no asterisk that absolves people with disabilities from the work that God has called each of us to participate in for his kingdom. So our job then, as co-laborers, is to equip one another for every good work, including people with disabilities, to make it possible for our brothers and sisters in Christ to do their work. What does work look like? Well, for me, I can think about it that way. My work can look a lot of different ways. I'm a fundraiser, so obviously my work can look like doing fundraising for the organization that I help support. But my work can also look like me sitting down by a friend and being there with them in a struggle that they're going through. My work can be helping out at a church event. Sometimes my work is greeting people as they come into the church and simply being a friendly face. There's nothing about my disability that would prevent me from being at the front of the church greeting people. It may just be cheering for my neighbor's kids at a hockey game. Now, I don't see much hockey here in America, but I think that might be a relevant term for our Canadian friends north of the border. But our work looks very different depending on what God has called us to do. But the main point is we're called to go out and do that work together. Now, I might need your care in order to do the work that we're called to do together. I will definitely need your friendship to go out and do the work that we're called to do together. But we cannot do the work together if I am back here and I am not even entertained as a possibility for participating in the kingdom work that God has called us to do. Now let's think about the witness that our churches present to the world when we say what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, that the parts of the body that we see as weaker are in fact indispensable. If that is true, if we believe that the Gospels, that the letters to the Corinthians are true, that Paul is speaking the inspired word of God, then that means all of us truly are indispensable to the kingdom work of God. People with disabilities are literally talked about in this letter as being indispensable to the church. Do our attitudes as church members, as Christians, reflect that truth? Mark, I'd love to hear what you think about what Cameron's work is, the work that he's been called and created to do by God.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the things that Cameron seems to do is I have a sister-in-law who would say, look at Cameron. He has his handicaps, but he's always happy. He's always content with what he has. And, you with all of your abilities can be so unhappy and want and want and want. That was always a big one. She always thought that was such a good lesson. The other thing that Cameron loves is he loves church. He loves going to church. And Cameron will literally hop and skip and run down the aisle to the place where we often sit. People find that to be really inspiring and uplifting. He is happiest in church and with his own, people from the church. The other thing is taking him to a long-term care home so that you can help, bring them all into a room so they can all sing together and that sort of thing. Some of these people will just sit there and watch Cameron and laugh, and he's tapping his feet and they just think it's wonderful. So for them, it's a really uplifting experience again. And I think also the last thing I'd like to say is that in the home where he is right now, it seems to be one of their main things, whether it's said or not, but being a co-laborer, providing him with all opportunities to be a co-laborer. He's out in the community and people are talking with him, to him, whatever. I think that's one of his biggest roles is his happiness, his contentness, and it seems like his incredible love of God.
One of the things that we can do when we hear about someone like Cameron is we can feel as though that work is not as essential as other work. But I always remind myself when I hear stories like that at Elam, because we have a lot of parents that I talk to at Elam, and we serve about 500 people with disabilities at Elam. And many parents have children who are very severely disabled, and they feel as though attributing certain gifts to their children is making more of something than what is actually the case. That if their child is happy, they're glad that their child is happy, but is that really a gift from God? Is that really part of their ministry on this earth? Think about the people whose lives are impacted by intersecting with each student. Think about the people whose lives have been impacted by intersecting with Cameron, how those lives have been changed. And do not tell me that is not work that Cameron has participated in. Do not tell me that is not gospel work that God specifically created Cameron to do. And do not tell me that we as a church are not supposed to be equipping Cameron to participate in that work. So I want to take a huge step back from this attitudes talk before I zero back in on it one last time. I want to be very clear about how our attitudes about disability impact people who live with disabilities and their families. Disability is almost always seen as a problem for the disabled person or for their family to overcome or solve. You guys have to figure out the solution to your problem. Disability is your problem. For whatever reason, God made you special to handle disability, to handle your disabled family member. This is ableism. There's ableism in so many ways in our world, but one of the main evidences of disability, of ableism, is that we expect people with disabilities to somehow overcome their disability in order to be useful in our world, to be part of our world. There are so many evidence of this. The very fact that we're talking and using language that we all understand, if things had turned out the way doctors thought they would for me, I would not be able to participate in this conversation because I would not have access to language the way that I do now. Steps leading into our churches and into our buildings, those steps can disable people who cannot go up and down steps. The ways that we connect in person and insist on connecting in person, those can be wonderful things, but they can also distance us from people who can't afford to be out in risky health situations during a pandemic. All of those things can be evidences of ableism. They can be. They don't have to be in every instance, but we need to recognize that they can be evidences of ableism. If we truly want to be co-laborers, then we are actually seeking justice. And this means, at the very least, recognizing and helping to dismantle the ableism that is within our churches. And there is ableism within our churches. For instance, in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and it specifically included exemption for churches, for church buildings, to be ADA compliant. The Association of Christian Schools International specifically lobbied against the legislation and for exemption for Christian schools to not have to comply with ADA. This is, frankly, embarrassing to me that happened. That we, it's one thing to have difficulty in making our buildings accessible. It's another to actively lobby against having to do it. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 14, we find the story of Paul. Well, Paul in his letter at that point is encouraging the Corinthians to support the Macedonian church. The Macedonian church does not have much. And he's saying that you, the Corinthians, you have, and it's time for you to give so that there might be fairness. That's the English Standard Version language. The NIV says so that there might be equality. That's something I think we have to recognize, that God actually wants there to be fairness. And in order for there to be fairness, we need to humble ourselves, and we need to shed ourselves of the attitudes that say disability is a problem for people affected by disability. It is not a problem for me. Disability is a problem for our churches. It's a problem that we have an obligation to address. It's a problem not because it's a disability, but because of the attitudes we have toward disability. That we assume that when somebody can't access something or participate in something, that that's their problem and it's not our problem as a church. We can help this situation. And one of the ways, certainly one of the ways that we can help is by forcing change. But what I'm asking us to do is to change our attitudes. And what I'm also asking us to do is to help our churches change our attitudes. So thank you very much for participating in this. Mark, do you have anything you want to add before we take any questions?
No, but I'm so thankful to have gone through this process to understand it more. It actually helps me settle some things in my own mind as well.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Becky, I saw that you noted and offered to take any questions from anybody, so I'll let you take over at this point.
Perfect. I do have a couple questions that have come in, so I'm just going to take them in order that they came in. And I think this first one ends up just following exactly how you left off, is just, and I know we get this a lot, but I'd love to hear your opinion on it, is basically how do we talk to church leadership when they just don't really feel that they need to address it because there's no one in their church that has disabilities? How do you work through that? And they're just, and just not open to attitudinal barriers that are going on. So feel free to jump on that one.
Monica, if I have lots of thoughts all the time. So I'm going to always offer you the chance first to say something, because otherwise I will take over. So please feel free if you have some thoughts to share.
I've never ever considered it before, actually. So,
Okay.
I mean, this is the first time that I'm thinking about it. And I think to myself, wow, things would have been so different had this sort of thing been, available to our church before. That's it. Go ahead.
All right. Two things occur to me. The first is statistics, and the second is 2 Corinthians. Statistics tell us that roughly 1 in 4, almost 1 in 4 households includes someone living with a disabling condition. That could be mental health issues. It could be a diagnosed physical or developmental disability, whatever it might be. If we are actually saying that our churches do not include people with disabilities, then are our churches truly reaching our community if we do not have relatively similar statistics to our community? If our community is 50%, Native American and 50% Caucasian, and our churches are 100% Caucasian, then our church probably isn't reaching our community. If our community is 23% people with disabilities, and we only have 5% of our church has a disability, then we have to ask ourselves if we're really reaching our community. So that's the first thing, is statistics. The second thing is 2 Corinthians. The parts of the body that we see as weaker are indispensable. Pastor, church leadership, please tell me where in this verse you see an option for us to not include people with disabilities. Tell me, justify that based on this Bible passage. Justify that. And then give them a tool to make it possible for them to include people with disabilities. And I certainly hope that the 5 stages can help with that.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to just put one more question out there because I realize we're getting close to the end time. No, that's great. But I do want to just wrap up with a little blessing that we have as well. And I'm going to shorten this question to be very specific. Dan, how do you view the need for Christians with the disabilities to advocate for themselves?
Well, I think it's very important. But what I tend to focus on is that we need to equip people with disabilities with the opportunity to advocate for themselves. I think so by nature, the 5 stages focuses on people without disabilities. It's constructed that way. So that's typically how I think of the need that we're addressing here. The need is not from, in the context of this tool, to equip people with disabilities to advocate for themselves or give them the opportunity to even. It's to make sure that people without disabilities are seeing how important it is for people with disabilities to be included, advocated alongside, and fully included in the work of the kingdom. That should not in any way negate the importance of people with disabilities advocating for themselves. And if anything, it should create an environment in which people with disabilities are equipped and supported in advocating for themselves. I hope.
Thanks, Dan. Yep. I am now going to turn it over to Mark to just have a quick closing, and then we'll end with a blessing.
Yeah. So Dan and Mark, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I'm wondering if there are any questions yet, lingering questions. Would you be willing to stick around for a little bit after our
Absolutely.
closing? Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Appreciate that very much. You know, Dan, your life would have been just as valuable and just as important if all those dire predictions that doctor had made to your parents had been exactly correct.
Yep.
And I give thanks to God that doctor was incorrect, not only for your parents, but for all of your friends, for your family, for your wife and children, and for me and for us. And thank you so much for sharing tonight. Margaret, it's just a joy to hear you and a little bit of your story about you and your husband and Cameron. And I thank God that you're willing to share of that. That's it takes some vulnerability to talk about the kinds of things you've been talking about tonight. So thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. Dan has created quite a number of really great resources over the years with regard to 5 stages. I think Becky's going to put those in chat, and we'll also put those online. All of this comes from our new resource, Everybody Belongs Serving Together. This is the 3rd edition of our handbook for advocates. And there was one essay, one disability perspective that made it from the 2nd edition to the 3rd edition. And that's one written by a distinguished author, Dan Vanderplaats, Changing Attitudes Toward People with Disabilities in the Church. And we're so pleased that we can include that again in here, too. We heard Cassie's introduction to Quiet Place. We heard her sing that just wonderful song that God gave to her and that she has given now as a gift to all of us who can hear it. And now we're going to close this time with a blessing from Cassie. And if you want to stick around and have any more questions, have a little more, a little less formal conversation, please feel free to do that.
Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you. Be gracious to you. Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.
Amen. Go in peace, everybody. And if you want to stick around, chat a little bit, Mark and Dan, feel free to do that.
Ooh.